Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala khatimil anbiya. At the outset, I would like to congratulate the head of department, the dean, and the whole team of our department Islamic Studies who have organized this conference on Islamic perspective on leadership. It's a very important topic and very much needed by the Muslim Ummah and particularly by our own university. We have launched a program of youth leadership under the leadership of our Tarbiyah department and already conducted one training program in which we selected from various faculties from all over the country youth who stayed together and learned how to play leadership role. And this is going to be an ongoing program of the university. Every intake, we will take from every intake a number of youth and then keep on increasing their size gradually till we have a sizable number of potential leaders of Muslim Ummah. When we talk about leadership, certain questions come to our mind, and quite often we think that leadership means someone with a charisma, someone who is different, someone who is unique. Islamic moral leadership is different. It's not charismatic, because charisma means it is personal or confined to the individual. It's not for everyone. It's the person's charisma that works, and that makes the leadership confined to the individual. Islamic paradigm of leadership is different, which essentially is a transformative leadership, a leadership which transforms people, which affects, influences people, which persuades people by its own role model. And the role model is such that it can be very easily worked out by a common man. Everyone cannot have a charismatic role, but everyone can have a role which is ethical, moral, and logical. Therefore, Islamic paradigm of leadership as it exists in the Quran is sending those persons who provide a perfect role model for human beings and not for angels. The Quran says very clearly, if there were angels on earth, we'll send an angel who will perform miracles. But since there are human beings, we send human beings so they can follow the person. And that's the point we quite often miss in our desire to see our leaders at a very high pedestal. Therefore, Islamic leadership is that which is immutable, which can provide ground for people to follow. Then what are its prerequisites? First and foremost is conviction or iman. A leadership which has no conviction in its own message is no leadership. If someone talks about Islamic equality, Islamic philanthropy, and has never been contributing a single penny to a social project, if a person talks about kindness and has always been unkind to his people, therefore conviction means what you have and what is reflected by your behavior. Secondly, leadership must have a vision. What does it want to achieve? Where it want to take leadership, people. And thirdly, it should have competence. If it is not competent, it cannot play a creative role, a constructive role. Fourthly, it must have knowledge. Without knowledge of what's happening around, what's happening in the world, what does the Quran and Sunnah guide us? How can a person lead? And lastly, the personality should have a confidence in the people. They should trust the person, and they should trust the person's words as well as actions. With these prerequisites, what are some of the basic attributes? Among these attributes, Islamic leadership or Quranic leadership means that it should not be a person who is self-centered, proud, and considering himself as the most wise person, but a person who is always learning from others. So, first and foremost, the leader has to be a learner, and that means he is open to suggestions, advisement, which the Quran calls shura. The Quran commands the Prophet, peace be upon him, to consult in all matters. وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. Secondly, the leadership should have an ijtihadi approach, which means innovation. Leadership should not be blind follower of what has been done earlier, but should explore new horizons, should be in a position to find out of the box solutions. Therefore, even in the lifetime of the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he asked Muaz ibn Jabal how he is going to manage affairs in Yemen, and Muaz said that I will use ijtihad, ijtihada bil-rai, then the Prophet showed his pleasure, satisfaction to the extent that he said, may Allah be praised who has allowed his servant to say what Prophet and Allah is pleasing, which means what Muaz said is pleasant to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Prophet himself. Both want ijtihad. Therefore, leadership has to have an ijtihadi approach. Thirdly, it has to be a person who is both mentally and physically fit, because the Quran has said elsewhere that the person should be qawi and should have both knowledge and physical power. Similarly, the leadership should have a capacity to communicate. We find that sometimes leaders who are brought up in so-called elite environment, they have no idea about how people talk among themselves and how they understand things. So they think in their own elitist environment and talk to people and then say ultimately these are very uncultured, uncivilized people, they don't understand what I am saying. No, leadership means it should be able to communicate the language people understand. And language does not mean just words, but means the essence, the message that's to be communicated. Next, it has to be optimistic. It has to be always hopeful. And if leadership is not optimistic, it will make the whole nation pessimist. The Quran tells us when you have done your best in consultation, then have tawakkul Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Fatawakkal Allah. This word fatawakkal Allah means that now you have full confidence and optimism because you did your best. Now rest of the work is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And similarly, leadership should be always ever improving in knowledge, spirituality and strategy, which is symbolized by one single word in the Quran. The word is tazkiyah. Tazkiyah means ongoing improvement in knowledge, spirituality, economic development, scientific development and so on and so forth. At the same time, the leadership has to be very humble and very polite and accommodative and not proud, not status conscious, not protocol conscious, but always acceptable to community. These are some of the attributes of leadership. If I want to summarize what I have been saying in these few minutes, then perhaps it can be summarized in 6 E's. First E is envisioning. Envisioning is based on Iman, it's based on knowledge of the Quran and Sunnah. It is based on what is the objective, your own projection or submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your own leadership or implementing what Allah wants from us. So envisioning is a matter of how you visualize the objective and how it's going to be achieved step by step. Second, it has to be ethical, moral. It cannot be brutal. It cannot be unfair. It cannot be unjust. Thirdly, it has to be energizing. It should be able to take people with it. It should give them enthusiasm. It should make them move. And that has to be done by role model, not by commands, threats and orders and ordinances, but by one's own model, one's own taking lead in doing things. Fourthly, it has to be educative. That means everything it does should give people a message of how they can themselves adopt that thing, and not only the leadership but the whole ummah, the whole nation becomes one single body with one single direction, with one single ambition, with one single goal. Fifthly, it has to be empowering. It should empower. It should not have concentration of authority, which is again a human phenomena. A small office with an executive officer, a manager, a dean, a director, an HOD leads the person to impose his or her authority. Leadership means empowerment, that you let people do it and not just think, I will do it, I alone can do it, and no one else can do it. And lastly, the last E is excelling. It must excel. It should not be mediocre. It should not stop by doing a few things, but must always be excelling. If these 6 E's are kept in mind, then we can very easily differentiate between the Islamic model of leadership as compared to so many models of leaderships which are provided by the so-called capitalist or socialist ideologies. Both ideologies have poisoned our mind, and quite often we think either we should have a model of Lenin and Stalin, so we have some Muslim Lenins and Stalins in Muslim countries, or we should have a model of someone who is always offering his other cheek to be slapped, very submissive, very humble, very polite. And both are extremes. Or a leadership which is always entrepreneurial, always looking for one's own advantage. These are the models which are provided. The only difference is those who plead for a entrepreneurial model, they add to it certain additional aspects. So the grim face of entrepreneur is covered up with very polite smile, what can I do for you? But the purpose is not what can I do for you. The purpose is how I can extract from you what I want. Now this dualism, this selfishness, this essence of capitalism is absent in Islamic concept of leadership. Here leadership is sharing, is concerned. The Quran says that you are killing yourself in order to somehow save people from hellfire. You have a burning fire in your heart which keeps you always melting for the with the fear that people may go to Jahannam and you want to save them. All the time you are killing yourself. Now that means it's not self-aggrandizement. It's not a matter of acquiring power, authority, or ultimately getting a certificate from people that leadership is very knowledgeable, very competent, so on and so forth. Everything that is done by leadership is not for recognition, but to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or His rida. This very briefly is the essence of how Islam looks on leadership. The topic requires much more details, examples, historic evidence, for which the time does not permit me. Therefore, I have tried to put very briefly the essence of how Islam looks on this important dimension of leadership, and how it is a very practical, doable model that's given to us in the form of the Sunnah and Seerah of the Khatam al-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Wa